Hi, it's Ray the Singing Tallit, continuing the reading of The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah by Alfred Edersheim. Please remember this book was written in the 1800s, so this is before archaeology became a thing. So some information is they can't draw from archaeological sources; they can only draw from historical sources. So please remember that. Chapter 6: The Nativity of Jesus the Messiah. Such then was the hope of the promise made of God unto the fathers, for which the 12 tribes, instantly serving God night and day, longed with such vividness that they read it into almost every event and promise, with such earnestness that it ever was the burden of their prayers, with such intensity that many and long centuries of disappointments have not quenched it. Its light, comparatively dim in the days of sunshine and calm, seemed to burn brightest in the days of lonely and dark nights and suffering. Of each gust that swept over Israel, it had only kindled it into a fresh flame. So what he's saying is, and this is true even today. I mean, you listen to any Chabad, ultra Orthodox prayers, you're going to hear the call for Messiah, the call for Messiah. Oh, Messiah hasn't come yet because we're not ready. We haven't done what we're supposed to. We haven't created the tikkun properly, so Messiah hasn't come yet. But the cry is for the return, or I'm sorry, for the arrival of Messiah. And of course, every Christian, is saying Bo Yeshua, or Come Jesus, Come Lord, Come. It's that continuous idea of we're waiting for our Savior to arrive, and it's just as present today as it was then 2,000 years ago. To the question whether this hope has ever been realized, or rather whether one has appeared whose claim to the Messiahship have stood the test of investigation and of time, impartial history can have only one answer. It points to Bethlehem and to Nazareth. If the claims of Yeshua have been rejected by the Jewish nation, he has at least undoubtedly fulfilled one part of the mission prophetically assigned to the Messiah. Whether or not he be of the loin of the tribe of Judah, to him assuredly has the gathering of the nations been, and the isles have waited for his law. Passing the narrow bonds of the obscurity of Judea, and breaking down the walls of a national prejudice and isolation, he has made the sublimer teaching of the Old Testament the common possession of the world, and founded a great brotherhood of which the God of Israel is the Father. He alone also has exhibited a life in which absolutely no fault can be found, and promulgated a teaching to which absolutely no exception can be taken. Admittedly, he was the one perfect man, the ideal of humanity. His doctrine, the one absolute teaching, the world has known no other, no equal, and the world has owned it, if not by the testimony of words, yet by the evidence of facts, springing from such people, born, living, and dying in circumstances, and using means the most unlikely of such results. The man of Nazareth has, by universal consent, been the mightiest factor in our world's history, alike politically and socially, intellectually and morally. If he be not the Messiah, he has at least thus far done the Messiah's work. If he be not the Messiah, there has at least been no other before or after him. If he be not the Messiah, the world has not and never can have a Messiah. So he's saying that if you consider the impact that Yeshua has had on the lives of the people in this world, like myself, people who were brought up in the Christian world and said, you know what, maybe we need to look into some of this Jewish stuff. Maybe we need to consider the writings of the Mishnah or the Talmud, or maybe we need to grow closer and have a stronger relationship with the Jews who've been safeguarding the Torah for all these years, and maybe we should study these works. Who else could have made a small town nobody from South Georgia care about a God and a nation 3,500 years ago, or a man that walked up a hill, or made me believe that 6,000 years ago the first two people came into being. Who else could have achieved such a thing? I couldn't imagine anyone else. The nations have certainly been rallying behind his flag, if nothing else. To Bethlehem as the birthplace of Messiah, not only did the Old Testament predict this, in Micah 5:2, but the testimony of rabbinic teachings unhesitantly pointed. Yet nothing could be imagined more directly contrary to Jewish thoughts and feelings, and hence nothing less likely to suggest itself to the Jewish invention than the circumstances which, according to the gospel narrative, brought about the birth of Messiah in Bethlehem. A counting of the people, or a census, and that census being taken and bidden of by a heathen emperor, executed by one so universally hated as Herod, would represent the N plus ultra of all that was most repugnant to the Jewish feeling. If the account of the circumstances which brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem has no basis in fact, but is a legend invented to locate the birth of Nazareth in the royal city of David, birth of the Nazarene in the royal city of David, it must be pronounced most clumsily devised. There is absolutely nothing to account for its origination, either from parallel events in the past or from contemporary expectancy. Why then connect the birth of the Messiah with what was most repugnant to Israel, especially if, as the advocates of the legendary hypothesis contend, it did not occur at a time when the Jewish census was taken, but 10 years previously? You have to remember that a census is not something that's welcome in Israel. Not since Moses did the only one that was ever asked for by God. When David did a census, there was much suffering that came afterward. And then it's always been considered a taboo to count Israel. But if it be impossible rationally to account for any legendary origin of the narrative of Joseph and Mary's journey to Bethlehem, the historical grounds on which its accuracy has been impugned are equally insufficient. They resolve themselves in this: that, beyond the gospel narrative, we have no solid evidence that Cyrenius was at that time occupying the needful position in the East to order such a registration for Herod to carry out. But even this feeble contention is by no means historically unassailable. At any rate, there are two facts which render any historical mistake by St. Luke on this point extremely difficult to believe. First, he was evidently aware of a census under Cyrenius 10 years later, according to Acts 5:37. Secondly, whatever rendering of Luke 2:2 may be adopted, it will be at least admitted that the intercalated sentence about Cyrenius was not necessary for the narrative, and that a writer must have intended thereby emphatically to mark a certain event. But an author would not be likely to call special attention to a fact of which he had only indistinct knowledge. Rather, if it must be mentioned, would he do so in the most indefinite terms. This presumption in favor of St. Luke's statement is strengthened by the consideration that such an event as the taxing of Judea must have been so easily ascertainable by him, meaning, of course, that the best records that empires keep are tax records. We are, however, not left to the presumptive reasoning just set forth, that the Emperor Augustus made registers of the Roman Empire, and the subject of the tributary states is now generally admitted. This registration for the purpose of future taxation would also embrace Palestine, even if no actual order to the effect had been issued during the lifetime of Herod. We can understand that he would deem it most expedient, both on the account of his relations to the emperor and in the view of the probable excitement which a heathen census would cause in Palestine, to take steps for making a registration, and that would rather do this according to Jewish rather than the Roman manner. This census, thus arranged by Augustus and taken by Herod in his own manner, was, according to St. Luke, quote, first really carried out when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, some years after Herod's death, when Judea had become a Roman province. We are now prepared to follow the course of the gospel narrative in consequence of the decree of Caesar Augustus. Herod directed a general registration to be made after the Jewish rather than the Roman manner. Practically, the two would indeed in this instance be very similar. According to Roman law, all country people were to be registered in their own city, meaning thereby the town to which the village or place where they were born was attached. In doing so, the house and the lineage, that is the nomen and the cognomen, of each were marked. According to the Jewish mode of registration, the people would have to be enrolled by tribe, then by family or clan, and then by the house of their fathers. But as the 10 tribes had not returned to Palestine, this could only take place to a very limited extent. While it would be easy for each to be registered in his own city in the case of Joseph and Mary, whose descent from David was not only known, but where, for the sake of the unborn Messiah, it was most important that this should be distinctly noted, it was natural that, in accordance with Jewish law, they should have gone into Bethlehem. Perhaps also, for many reasons which will readily suggest themselves, Joseph and Mary might be glad to leave Nazareth and seek, if possible, a home in Bethlehem. Indeed, so strong was that feeling that it afterwards required special divine direction to induce Joseph to relinquish this chosen place of residence and to return to the Galilee. And that's from Matthew 2:22. In these circumstances, Mary, now the wife of Joseph, was standing with him only in the actual office of a betrothed, according to Luke 2:5, and would, of course, accompany her husband to Bethlehem. Irrespective of this, every feeling and hope in her must have prompted such a course, and there is no need to discuss whether Roman or Jewish census usage required her presence, a question which, if put, would have to be answered in the negative. In the short winter's days, probably closing in, as the 2 travelers from Nazareth, bringing with them the few necessities of a poor Eastern household, near their journey's end, if we think of Jesus as the Messiah from heaven, the surroundings of outward poverty, so far from detracting, seem congruous to his divine character. Earthly splendor would seem like some tawdry tinsel, and outmost simplicity like that the clothing of lilies, which far surpassed all the glory of Solomon's court. But only in the East would the most absolute simplicity be possible, and yet neither it nor the poverty from which it sprang necessarily imply even the slightest taint of social inferiority. The way had been long and weary, at the least 3 days' journey, whatever route had been taken from Galilee. Most probably it would be that so commonly followed from the desire to avoid Samaria. If you remember, the Pharisees taught everyone that they were not to travel through Samaria because it would make them unclean. Along the eastern banks of the Jordan to the fords of Jericho. Although passing through one of the warmest parts of the country, the season of the year must, even in its most favorable circumstances, have greatly increased the difficulties of such a journey. A sense of rest and peace must unconsciously have crept over the travelers when at last they reached the rich fields that surrounded the house of bread. This is Bethlehem, the house of bread. And passing through the valley which, like an amphitheater, sweeps up to the twain heights along which Bethlehem stretches. That's 2,700 feet above the sea. Ascended through the terraced vineyards and gardens. Winter though it was, the green and slippery or silvery foliage of the olive might, even at the season, mingle with the pale of the pink of the almonds, nature's early waker, and with the dark coloring of the opening peach buds. The chaste beauty and sweet quiet of the place would recall memories of Boaz, of Jesse, and of David. All the more would such things suggest themselves from the contrast between past and present. For as the travelers reached the heights of Bethlehem, and indeed long before, the most prominent object in view must have been the great castle which Herod had built, and called after his own name, perched on the highest hill southeast of Bethlehem. It was at the same time a magnificent palace, strongest fortress, and almost courtier city. With a sense of relief, the travelers would turn from this to mark the undulating outlines of the highland wilderness of Judea, till the horizon was bounded by the mountain ridges of Tekoa. Through the break of the hills, eastward, the heavy molten surface of the Sea of Judgment would appear in view. Westward wound the road to Hebron. Behind them lay the valleys and hills which separated Bethlehem from Jerusalem and concealed the holy city. But for the present such thought would give way to the pressing necessity of finding shelter and rest. The little town of Bethlehem was crowded with those who had come from all outlying districts to register their names, even if the strangers from far-off Galilee had been personally acquainted with anyone in Bethlehem, who could have shown them hospitality, they would have found every house fully occupied. The very inn was filled. The only available space was where ordinarily the cattle were stabled. Bearing in mind the simple habits of the East, this scarcity implies that it would in the West, and perhaps in the seclusion and the privacy from the noisy, chattering crowd which thronged the khan, would be all the more welcome. Scanty as these particulars are, even thus much is gathered rather by inference than from the narrative itself. Thus early in the history does the absence of details, which painfully increases as we proceed, remind us that these Gospels were not intended to furnish a biography of Jesus, nor even the materials for it, but had only this twofold object, that those who read them might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing they might have life through his name. The Christian heart and imagination indeed long to be able to localize the scene of such surprising importance, and linger with fond reverence over the cave which is now covered by, quote, the Church of the Nativity, unquote. It may be, nay, it seems likely, that this, to which most venerable tradition points, was the sacred spot of the world's greatest event, but certainly we have not. It is better that it should be so, as to all that passed in the seclusion of that stable, quote unquote, the circumstances of the Nativity, even its exact time after the arrival of Mary, brief as it must have been, the Gospel narrative is silent. This only is told, that then, there, the Virgin Mother brought forth her firstborn Son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger. Beyond the announcement of the bare fact, Holy Scripture, with indescribable appropriateness and delicacy, draws a veil over the most sacred mystery. Two impressions only are left on the mind, that of the utmost earthly humility in the surrounding circumstances, and that of the inward fitness and the contrast suggested by them, instinctively, reverently, to feel it is well, and it should have been so. It best befits the birth of Christ, if he be what the New Testament declares him as. So apparently he thinks that Christ was born at Christmas time, which would mean that John the Baptist was born at the height of summer, because Christmas is the celebration of the end, the celebration of the beginning of winter, but the end of the winter solstice. I don't think that is correct. I personally feel that Yeshua was either born at Passover or at Sukkot, but he does make the point of saying, well, if he's born during a census, excuse me, they're not going to do a census during a festival. Excuse me. Because the festival would require that everyone be present in Jerusalem, which seems like a better time to count people if you're going to count them, if you ask me. But he's saying, according to the Roman style of census, that you'd have to go to the city, which is implied by the scripture. But by the Jewish method, you simply need to be registered by your tribe, clan, and father's house. Now, I do have a question about that. If the birth records were kept at the temple, wouldn't it be most sensible to go to the temple to get yourself registered in the Jewish manner? But as we pass from the sacred gloom of the cave out into night, its sky all aglow with starry brightness, its loneliness is peopled, and its silence made vocal from heaven, there is nothing now to conceal, but much to reveal, though the manner of it would seem strangely incongruous to the Jewish thinking. And yet Jewish tradition may here prove both illustrative and helpful. That the Messiah must be born in Bethlehem was a settled conviction. Equally so was the belief that he was to be revealed from Migdal Eder, that is to say, the tower of the flock. This Migdal Eder was not the watchtower for ordinary flocks which pastured on the barren sheep grounds beyond Bethlehem, but lay close to the town on the road to Jerusalem. A passage in the Mishnah, which is Shek 7.4, leads to this conclusion. that the flocks which pastured there were destined for temple sacrifice. So he's saying that the shepherds were Levites, actually, who were keeping these flocks. And according that the shepherds who watched over them were not ordinary shepherds. The latter were under the ban of rabbinism on account of their necessary isolation from religious ordinances and their manner of life, which rendered strict legal observances unlikely, if not absolutely impossible. The same Mishnah passage also leads us to infer that these flocks lay out all the year round, since they are spoken of as in the fields 30 days before Passover, that is, in the month of February, when in Palestine the average rainfall is nearly greatest. That's the latter rain, the former rains. That's the former rains. The latter rains happen at the end of the latter rains prepare the world. Well, I should say they prepare the ground for death. The former rains wake it from death. So, fall to spring. That's how you can keep up with that. Let's see. Thus, the Jewish tradition is in some dim manner apprehended in the first revelation of the Messiah from Migdal Eder, where shepherds watch the temple flocks all the year round. Of this deep symbolic significance of such a coincidence, it is needless to speak. It was then on that wintry night of the 25th of December, I mean, really, that shepherds watched the flocks destined for the... Is he going to tell me that there were 3 wise men there too? In that very place consecrated by tradition, as that where the Messiah was first revealed, of a sudden came the long-delayed, unthought of announcement. Heaven and earth seemed to mingle as suddenly as an angel stood before their dazzled eyes, while the outstreaming glory of the Lord seemed to enwrap them as a mantle of light. Surprised, awe, and fear would be hushed into calm and expectancy, as from the angel that heard that what they saw boded not judgment, but ushered in to waiting Israel the great joy of those good tidings which he brought, that the long-promised Savior, Messiah Lord, was born in the city of David, and that they themselves might go and see, and recognize him by the humbleness of the circumstances surrounding his nativity. It was as if attendant angels had only waited the signal, as when the sacrifice was laid on the altar. The temple music burst forth in 3 sections, each marked by the blast of the priest's silver trumpets, as each psalm were to be Tris Hagion. So, when good tidings had been brought, excuse me, so that when the herald angel had spoken, a multitude of heaven's hosts stood forth to him the good tidings he had brought. What they sang was but the reflex of what had been announced. It told in the language of the praise of character the meaning, the result of what had taken place. Heaven took up the strain of glory. Earth echoed it as peace. It fell on the ears and the hearts of men as a good pleasure. Only once before had the words of angels' hymns fallen on mortal ears, when to Isaiah's rapt vision the heaven's high temple had opened, and the glory of Jehovah swept through its courts, almost breaking down the trembling posts that bore its boundary gates. Now the same glory enwrapped the shepherds on Bethlehem's plains. Then the angels' hymn had heralded the announcement of the kingdom coming. Now that the king had come, then it had to be the trihagion of prophetic anticipation, now that of evangelic fulfillment. The hymn had ceased, the light faded out of the sky, and the shepherds were alone. But the angelic message remained with them, and the sign which was the guide to them, to the infant Christ, lighted their rapid way up the terrace height to where, at the entering of Bethlehem, the light swinging over the hostelry directed them to the strangers of the house of David, who had come from Nazareth, though it seemed as if, in the hour of her utmost need, the Virgin Mother had not been ministered to by loving hands. Yet what had happened in the stable must have become known in the khan. Perhaps friendly women were still passing to and fro on errands of mercy, when the shepherds they had reached the stable. There they found perhaps not what they had expected, but as they had been told. The holy group only consisted of the humble Virgin Mother, the lowly carpenter of Nazareth, and the babe laid in the manger. What further passed we know not, save this: having seen it for themselves, the shepherds told what had been spoken to them about this child to all around, in the stable, in the fields, probably also in the temple, to which they would bring their flocks, thereby preparing the minds of a Simeon, of an Anna, and of all that looked for the salvation of Israel. And now the hush of wondering expectancy fell once more on all who heard what was told by the shepherds, this time not only in the countryside of Judea, but within the wider circle that embraced Bethlehem and the holy city. And yet it seemed all so sudden, so strange, that on such slender thread as the feeble throb of an infant's life, the salvation of the world should hang, and no special care watch over its safety, no better shelter be provided than that of a, and he keeps using stable in quotation marks, no other cradle than a manger. I would like to point out that in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, it says sukkah, not stable. And still it is ever so. On what slender thread has the continued life of the church often seemed to hang, and on what feeble throbbing that every child of God, with no visible outward means to hang off danger, no home of comfort, no rest of ease, but lo, children are Jehovah's heritage, and so giveth he to his beloved in his sleep. And I will say that that is true. The children that you have, that you give up to him, they're his kids. So remember that when you're worrying about what your kids are doing, or what's going to happen to them. Try not to be a helicopter parent like me. I got a bad problem about that, getting involved too often, when I just need to remember they're his kids. They're his kids too. If he lets them kids die, he lost his kids. It ain't just me losing mine. He lost his. I try to remember that. So, of course, we can see that Alfred Edersheim is definitely an Anglican priest preaching good old Catholic Christmas, which is a bummer for me, but hey, I didn't write the book. Just because there's one thing in there I don't agree with doesn't mean I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's lots of very pertinent and very interesting information in his books. Definitely suggest you read The Temple and Its Ministries and the Sketches of Jewish Social Life. Both of them are excellent and don't involve any kind of, possible propagation of mythologies. It's just, they do a great job talking about how things worked at that time and how people took care of the business of living in Israel and of attending to the services of the temple. Because those are both very important things in the life of a Jew during the Second Temple period, which is what we're studying about now. We're learning about that. As far as it goes for the type of census process that took place, well, I don't know. Was it a standard Roman census as Augustus would have required, or was it a census that Herod would have put together because he wanted to make sure that Rome got its payments without kicking off too much resistance to Rome because of the taboo in Israel against counting a census in general, because that's a big taboo in Israel, because everybody's worried about what God's going to do if there's a census taken, like David did. Well, like I said, plenty of information. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I definitely don't think that the Messiah was born on December 25th. But who knows? Kislev 25 and December 25 line up every once in a while. And of course, that's Hanukkah. That's the rededication of the temple at Kislev 25. So, which of course says to me that the reason it was rededicated then was because that was when it had been defiled. Which, why would they defile it on Kislev 25? Because it happened to line up with December the 25th, which is Christmas. Why wouldn't they defile the temple on the day of the birth of the sun god? Because that is what December 25th is. And I don't know if he knew that, but he was writing this book 200 years ago. Maybe not that long. Let's say late 1800s, but before archaeology, certainly before the internet, certainly before mass communication. When if you wanted to learn something, only place you could get it was at a library controlled by whoever your people were that you were associated with. So, be blessed in Yeshua's name. Thank you for listening, and thank you for taking the time to just observe these great works of the past, which I personally believe will give us a lot of information that we need for today. Be blessed.